Alright, so diving into the Chevy Luv here again. I've been off working on other things, but it's time to get back at this thing. So we got some ignition tuning, some carburetor tuning, get some exhaust on this thing. The brakes kind of hang up a little bit and get that fixed, and we should be ready to roll, and we'll see how this thing can hog through the mud and whatnot. So anyway, we're going to go ahead and work through all the problems and get this thing back on the road. First things first here, we're going to take a crack at this Weber or Weber, however you pronounce it, this little foreign job carburetor. Now what's interesting about this carburetor in particular versus ones I've seen before is it doesn't have any progressive linkage. It opens both butterflies at the same time. And this is just a little 1.8 liter engine or so, so I'd imagine that's getting quite a bit of fuel. But anyway, I did a little looking up on them, and they take about, 5 PSI of fuel pressure and whatnot anymore, and they start sinking the float. The guy who had it kind of had a decent idea of what he was doing, but we're going to go ahead and pop the top of the carburetor off here and check our float, reset our float height, and then we'll get some of our tools on this thing and see if we can get a tune on it. So I'm going to get this off and we'll keep working through it. Here's kind of a close look at the innards of the carburetor here. It's got one of those foam style floats. So what I don't like about these is they break down when you use gasoline that has alcohol in it, so your basic ethanol fuels. Luckily in Iowa we have a choice, but in a lot of places you don't necessarily. Anyway, the floats are set kind of high, so I'm going to set these down a little lower. The issue the carburetor was having was when it got up to RPM, just sitting here you could see fuel start to dribble out of the boosters, and it wasn't atomizing well. Well, your floats and kind of the dynamics of your carburetor, based on your float height and the amount of fuel you have sitting here in your bowl, if you have more fuel sitting in your bowl, which with a higher float height, that fuel at a lower RPM will start coming through your boosters. Now likewise, a lower float setting, you'll have less fuel and you'll have to reach a higher RPM before it'll start pouring through your boosters again. So we're going to set our float height a little bit lower. It's, like I said, pretty high right now. So then, getting up to 1800, 2000 RPM where we actually need the fuel coming out versus the 1400 or 1500 RPM where it was flowing before, then we'll have enough engine RPM and vacuum to atomize the fuel through the boosters and we'll be fine. But I'm a little reluctant to take this carburetor off because it looks like someone who was working on it was dead set on thinking they had a vacuum leak, and that was their issue, that they were lean. So they got dope all around this thing trying to find gasket leaks and whatnot. And I'm afraid I'm going to destroy my carburetor gaskets if I take all that off. So good news is we know we don't have any vacuum leaks because we know they got it good and sealed. The bad news is that's a pretty good mess down there. So anyway, what I'm going to go ahead and do is we're going to get this all back on, reset our float height, get our mix screws run all the way down, then turned 1.5 turns out, and then we'll hook our vacuum gauge in and our timing light, and we can tune from there. But I'm going to get this float reset, get this back on there. We'll take a look at the fuel system on this truck because it's pretty neat, and we'll keep moving right along. Alright, I got the carb back together and everything all adjusted. The mixture screws are adjusted properly. It's kind of a pain in the butt on this thing really without removing the carburetor. Your mix screws, one's here for each barrel, and then there's one on this other side which you can't even really see down there, but it's pretty impossible to get a screwdriver down here, so you kind of have to remove the carburetor to do this. Now what I did is I just took the end of my multi-bit screwdriver off and got down in there and turned it. But what I couldn't do is really get in there, and I guess I could have adjusted the choke, but for tuning purposes here, and because there was no little clip on our choke blades where they could just flop open, what I did is I unhooked the linkage to the choke, which I still have, and I just wired it back so we don't have this fluttering closed on any of our trial runs and test runs. But anyway, got everything adjusted. We're running just off the carburetor, no choke. So once it's warmed up and good enough to operating temperature, we can get a tune in this thing. Alright, we got our vacuum gauge hooked up and our timing light hooked up, hooked onto cylinder 1. Now, really, these are the only two tuning tools that you need to properly tune a carbureted engine. That and a little bit of know-how. I also like to run O2 gauges, but those require a little bit extra work to get on, and with stock engines, you can usually tune them up pretty good with these two items alone. So, like I said, we have the timing light hooked to spark plug number 1 about as close to the engine as we possibly can get an accurate reading, and it's all hooked up and working right. And we have our vacuum gauge hooked in. Now ideally you want to hook a vacuum gauge to right below the carburetor to full manifold vacuum through the whole carburetor, but in this case they slathered all that gasket dope all over everything, and to get to a port it's all sealed up, and I have to pull the carburetor off and clean it up, and it's going to destroy my gaskets. And I don't have any extra today, so we're just going to see how this works. But ideally you want to pull from right under the carburetor. You can see it's going to have better signal through that one cylinder. So anyway, I guess we're ready to fire it up and get some tune in this thing. Let's give her a couple pumps here and light her off. Oh, clutch pedal always gets me. I'm used to the old 60s cars. Oh, come on, starter. There we go. So it's gonna idle pretty rough till we get some temp under without a choke, but impressively enough, it actually can hold an idle dead cold, so that's already a pretty good improvement over how it was beforehand. Alright, so already we're way ahead. I'm gonna pull on the throttle here and we'll see that it's just not dumping a ton of fuel down the barrels. And we got some ignition work to do. Even our gauge here on a stock engine, we should have 18 to 20 degrees of vacuum. It's hunting around a little bit, so we got some adjustments to be made with our idle mix screws and our main throttle plate there. But anyway, we'll take a look down the carburetor. So not bad. It couldn't even do that beforehand. Alright, we're ready to set our ignition timing. I got the distributor hold down nut loose so our distributor can move around. There we go. And I pulled the vacuum advance line off a full manifold vacuum and capped it. Obviously I didn't have anything to stick in it, so I thought, oh, we'll just borrow a carb screw. So anyway, we'll go ahead and fire it up. We can see our timing marks kind of down there, and I'm assuming there's a mark on the pulley. So let's go ahead and fire it up and get some timing in her. And then once we get the timing we want, which I'm going to shoot for 10 to 12 degrees of initial timing, then we can go ahead and set our carb the way we want it, and we should be pretty good to go on the engine side of things, at least. But we're getting closer because it fires right off just when we bump the key. Well, if the starter would go. There we go. Pretty good runner. Alright. We got the timing set to 10 degrees of initial timing. So I think we're good. We'll go ahead and tighten down our hold down nut. Put our vacuum advance back on. And we should be good to go. And now we can see if we can get some more manifold vacuum out of this thing. Alright, we got our mix screws all adjusted. And we got about 18 degrees, or excuse me, 18 inches of vacuum. And you see it hunting ever so slightly back and forth within the same area. And that's because, again, we're pulling, we got a cylinder bias there. So it's causing that fluctuation. But pretty good overall. It's staying within itself. You know, if you see it walking around, that's when you have poor adjustment. So anyway, kind of the idea behind mixture screws is I start 1.5 to 2 turns out, And as I go, I lean it down until I get the highest vacuum reading I can, until the, and once I get to that highest vacuum point, then I'll richen them, which is open them up a quarter of a turn. And then we can run safe from there. So I guess we conclude this day with a coolant leak, and all things considered, if that's the worst we're gonna have happen when we get it fired up, where I can look it over for the first time, I'm really not too mad. So more work to do, but like I said, we're moving right along and taking steps in the right direction here.